Hi, everyone. My name is Vikas. Welcome to a very early and special edition of T4 TV. Today, I'm glad that a friend of mine has agreed to participate. His name is Jiang. Jiang is welcome to this live stream, Jiang. But
Hi, everyone.
the thing about you and think about you and I have been friends for a very long time. And you are my go-to person for education in China. And
Thank you.
so what I thought was, you've been very helpful to me in the past about how I should be thinking about education in China and all the different facets to it. So you've attended conferences with me, you've spoken on panels, you've written books. You used to have a newspaper column, if I'm not mistaken. You're a researcher at Harvard. You yourself were a teacher. And everything emanates from that. And so I wanted to use this opportunity just to speak to you about exactly that, right? Which is what is the status of education in China, given that there's a lot of interest, I think, in what happens in your part of the world,
Right.
given all in the recent past. Beijing and Shanghai have shot up on the PISA rankings. There's a lot of conversation about the use of technology in classrooms and some of the breakthroughs that are happening in China that we never hear about unless they're sensationalized in our media. And so I want to just pick your brains. But before we go into these deeper subjects, tell me, Jiang, in terms of if you could give us the contours
Sure.
of the education sector in China. How big is it? How many schools? How many teachers? And just give us some interesting nuggets so that everyone can understand the diversity of the sector.
Sure. So China has the world's largest public school system. It educates about 200 million children, and it's a very monolithic system. So you have schools around China are about the same. You have 50 kids in a class taught by one teacher, and the teacher will stay with the student throughout the school day. Because there's so many students and because education resources are scarce in China, meaning there are not that many universities, we have a competitive college entrance examination, which every child has to take in order to get into college. And that's considered the fairest way to distribute scarce education resources. At the same time, as you can imagine, this creates a lot of pressure on kids to perform. So we have a very stressful school system. And in terms of EdTech, I would say that China has many advantages that has enabled China to become the world's the biggest EdTech market, but also the most lucrative. And I would say there are three distinct advantages. The first is that there's a cultural obsession with education. So parents are heavily invested in their child's education. We mean this financially, right? So parents will go into heavy debt to finance their child's education. We also mean it in terms of time and emotion as well. So parents will every evening spend their evenings helping the kids do homework. And when parents get together, all they talk about are their kids' education, their test scores, and all that. As you can imagine, this is very stressful. Second major advantage is that because there's an obsession with test scores, that's actually good for EdTech, right? Because it makes education into a solvable problem. It's not if you think about education as well-being, EdTech really can't solve that problem. But if it's just about improving test scores, then EdTech can solve that problem. And the third major advantage is that there's a communication app called WeChat that dominates the EdTech space in China. So rather than use 3 or 4 different apps, teachers and parents and students can communicate just using WeChat. They can communicate, they can live stream their teaching, they can send lesson plans over, they can do everything within WeChat. So that's basically a rough summary of the Chinese education context.
And so, Jiang, you talk about so many schools, and because of the high pressure kind of environment that you have and the expectations that are quite high when it comes to children's education in China, you say what you talked about and you touched on, and we want to talk about more about, is the use of learning technologies, also referred to as EdTech. There's quite a few success stories that come from China, but also on the same side of the coin are the failures, but which we don't necessarily hear about as much. And so let's take that in that order. So, what would you say are the EdTech success stories from China?
Right, thanks. So I would say there are three major successes we see every day in China. The first, in terms of parental engagement. So every classroom has an online WeChat community where parents talk amongst themselves on how to improve their child's learning. And if you think about it, these online communities, they create these instantaneous feedback loops, right? So if you're a parent and you have a question, the teacher responds right away, or another parent responds right away. And that increases focus, motivation, and engagement. So that's one major success. Second success is in terms of teacher training. So urban teachers are responsible for mentoring rural teachers. And what they'll do is they'll send their lesson plans over, and they'll live stream their teaching so that rural teachers can emulate the teaching. And then rural teachers themselves will teach a class themselves, live stream it, and then get instantaneous real-time feedback from the urban teachers. And this is a way to scaffold rapid teacher improvement in poorer areas. And the third area of success, and this is really the major area of success, is in test preparation. So that students in smaller cities are able to access better education resources in bigger cities. They're able to get teachers to tutor them online. And this is very lucrative for both teachers and for online providers. EdTech also has enabled students to do many test questions and get instantaneous feedback. And what we find is that it does improve test scores. So it's a lot better to do more test questions than it is to learn the material more deeply.
So there's in this part of the world, at least, there's a swathe of companies in the EdTech sector that do fantastic well. So one, for example, we had the founder of a company called Pango on here, which is all to do with lesson planning and resource sharing for teachers. And they built a community. In a similar way, what are the big EdTech businesses in China called, and what is it that they're focused on?
Right. So we have many success stories. In fact, most of the EdTech unicorns in the world are based in China. So one example is VIP Kid. What they do is they connect Chinese students with English speakers in Western countries. And that's very popular. Parents love it. Learning English is a priority here in China. So VIP Kid is an example of a success story. There's also something called Squirrel AI, which you probably know. But Squirrel AI, they do test prep, and they're AI based. So students will go into these test centers after school, and then they'll sit in front of a computer, and then they'll do test questions. And based on the performance, the computer will then customize test questions for them. And Squirrel AI has been extremely successful here in China. So I would say those are the two big EdTech success stories here so far.
And when we talk about the flip side of the coin, what are the things that, as a result of through the use of EdTech, we've now realized are some of its biggest failures? Can you tell us about that in terms of, I know that you are not necessarily a votary of the use of tech necessarily. So tell us a little bit as to what you think the failings are as a result of the use of tech in Chinese classrooms.
Sure. So I would say the three big areas where EdTech has failed us is in terms of motivation, equity, and creativity, right? So motivation is that to be great learners, students have to be intrinsically motivated. And what we find in China is that EdTech doesn't make students more intrinsically motivated. In fact, it can often make them less motivated. And I believe this is also true in other contexts as well, right? Because of COVID-19, kids are learning at home. And what we're finding is that the learning gap between intrinsically motivated students and then other students have greatly increased. So motivation is something that I think is true throughout the world. Second thing is equity. China has spent billions of dollars in providing broadband access to rural schools. Rural schools, they lack good teachers. And the idea is that, hey, if we connect rural students with urban teachers, then the learning outcomes of these rural kids will increase greatly. But that's not the case. What we find is that the emotional isolation is a bigger problem than lack of access to technology. And the third big area is creativity. So, Chinese schools have spent a lot of money on smart boards, on really the most advanced technology. But it often makes teachers lazy, because what teachers can do is they can download a PPT, a PowerPoint from online, and then recite it in class. So EdTech has been a double-edged sword for schools. And I think the main takeaway is that, EdTech does not remedy, it amplifies. So if you're a school that's struggling, it makes you struggle even more. If you're a school that's thriving, it makes you thrive even more. And I think that what EdTech has taught us in China is the importance of providing emotional support to students, on focusing on their well-being, and making sure that they're part of a loving and supportive community.
I mean, but is that a common thing? I mean, from what our perception of Chinese education is, and what you said earlier was this incessant focus on test prep and test scores.
Right. Right.
Does that lead to a caring community towards that child and the learner?
Right. Okay. So that's a good point, right? A lot of Chinese focus on EdTech is to believe that this will deliver higher test scores. But what we find on the ground when we do research is that if you actually focus on children's well-being, then you improve test scores. So let me give you some examples of this. Okay, so I've done some research in rural schools, and I've been focused a lot on rural school transformation. How do you make a low-performing school into a better-performing school? And the answer is not actually more technology. The answer is more community. So principals who've gone in and transformed schools have done certain things right. First is they get parents more engaged. This means visiting the parents' home and saying, listen, I'm here, I'm new here, I have a lot to learn, but I want to be your friend. If you have any concerns about your child, come see me. It means helping teachers develop, right? So every morning, the principal will sit down with teachers and talk about lesson planning and be a mentor to these teachers. And the third key element is to give voice and agency to students. So encouraging students to speak up more in class, giving students opportunities to be creative, to speak up, to perform in front of parents, right? So it's building a community where everyone supports each other. This leads to higher test scores. But you're right in that there's this misconception in China that more technology will lead to higher test scores, and that's why there's so much money invested, and that's why there's so much parental support behind EdTech. But the research tells us that it's actually the community support that leads to higher test scores.
I mean, so Jiang, I know that you and I have this discussion, but I want to just ask you this question because I think the viewers and the audience for this live stream may be interested. Is, over the last few years, like I said in my introduction, obviously certain cities in China have done very well when it comes to PISA. And there's this overwhelming view that Chinese education is flying, right, in terms of just achievement. Is that the case?
So I think it's a complicated issue. As you say, there's a lot of diversity in China. So PISA only takes a snapshot of certain regions of China. Shanghai is doing extremely well. Jiangsu, Zhejiang province, Beijing, obviously these are the wealthiest provinces in China. We also have to look at the history of Chinese education, right? So from 1949 to 1999, there's a heavy focus on equity issues in China, meaning that a lot of really well-educated urban teachers were sent to rural areas to teach. And that had transformative effect on Chinese education, which led to massive dividends today. So in 1949, only a quarter of Chinese could read and write. It was the priority of the government to make sure that everyone was literate. So there was this massive campaign to send these urban teachers to these rural areas. And over 50 years, we've had this massive transformation in education. So let me quickly explain why this transformation happened. We found that the gap between the rural areas and the urban areas, it was not one of teacher quality, it was actually one of mentality. So 1949, that around that time, there's a real fatalism that was destroying communities in these rural areas. They didn't believe they could leave the countryside. They believed that, listen, I'm a farmer. My kid's gonna be a farmer. My grandchildren are gonna be farmers. So why study? What was the point? But if you go to the urban areas, there's a real optimism about education. Like education can transform lives. You have to work hard. And what happened when you send urban teachers to these rural communities is they brought their optimism with them. And they believed in these kids. And these kids found the motivation to work hard. So let me tell you a story that highlights this. I used to at Tsinghua High School. As you know, Tsinghua University High School, one of the best high schools in China. My boss there, born in June, he actually grew up in the countryside. During the Cultural Revolution, he was a primary school kid, and a professor from the city was sent to teach him. This professor was an astrophysics professor, never taught children before, didn't know how to teach children, was completely incompetent at it. So what he did was, he said to the kids, listen, let's not do math, let's not do Chinese, I don't know how to teach you stuff. Let's just go look out at the night sky. So they went out at night to look at the sky, and the professor would tell them what he saw. And the kids, these are primary school kids. They really didn't understand what he was saying, but they became infected by his curiosity, by his thought processes, and by his love of learning. So that every one of these 50 kids, every one of them got a PhD. And these are kids who are children of farmers, and they expect to be farmers, but some guy, a professor, came in and reimagined this classroom of students into a community of scholars. And he believed in them, and he tutored them, mentored them, so that they all became professors.
So I remember a few years ago, Jiang, was that, we used to look at the status of teachers in my last role that I had. Yeah. And, we published a few reports around the status of teachers. Can you tell us, in terms of where it lies, is there any truth to it that teachers are seen in the same regard as doctors, or is it that they're seen in the same regard as librarians or more labor workers, right? And so tell us a little bit more as to, that question, and who today becomes a teacher in China?
Right. So we've had massive changes in the teaching profession over these past, 70 years. But before 1999, it was really the best and brightest who went into the teaching profession. China's a socialist country. Everyone was paid the same. You were a doctor, you were a teacher, you were a laborer, you were a peasant, you were paid exactly the same amount of money. So the best and brightest, the best students, they went into teaching because they enjoyed school and they enjoyed sharing their teaching with other kids, and because they were so bright, they really made the Chinese school system into a very vibrant and creative school system. I think this is something people don't really understand. That before 1999, China was a very vibrant school system. John Dewey, experiential education, holistic learning, they were all major influences on Chinese education prior to 1999. With the advance of the market economy, unfortunately, the best and brightest went into finance rather than into teaching. And you can imagine this had a major impact on the overall quality of the teaching profession. But at the end of the day, teaching is still a highly respected profession. Teachers work extremely hard. And I think a lot of it is due to the cultural obsession with education here in China. Parents are very deferential to teachers. So teachers feel motivated to work hard. And it becomes a virtuous feedback loop, if you think about it, right? Parents are differential to teachers are motivated, so they work harder, so parents become more differential. I believe teachers are as highly respected as doctors here in China. They work very hard. I mean, I'm a teacher trainer. I've worked with a lot of Chinese teachers. What really impresses me is their passion for learning, for self-improvement. When I go teach, when I go train them, they're open to new ideas. And so that's what makes training them so gratifying.
And so, most parts of the world, Jiang, have a teacher recruitment and retention crisis. Does the same apply to China?
So that's a great question. I believe China has done an amazing job in terms of teacher retention rates. So why is that? China has a great system of teacher training, right? So when you come into the system, you have mentors. Every week, you have 1 day of professional development. And you as a teacher can see yourself develop over time. You become better. There's a real focus on collaboration and on improvement. And this community has really made teachers more motivated. And so the retention rate is actually quite high in China. And I think this is a lesson that the rest of the world can learn. Don't focus on pay. Don't focus on status. Focus more on continuous learning and development, because then the teachers will feel they're contributing to the community and they feel a lot better about themselves.
So, Jiang, I know that you also have some thoughts on what is called the third education revolution.
Right.
Can you paint out what you think that is?
Yeah.
Because
so
the reason I say that is that I think we're still stuck in the first.
Yeah, I agree. So the first education revolution is really the building of the public school system, right? The idea that students can go to school and not actually just stay on a farm and learn stuff. And this was brought about because of course the Industrial Revolution. The second education revolution is the building of the meritocracy. And this has really created the world we live in today, right? The idea that the best and brightest should go to the best universities. And that's what's really propel the knowledge economy. And I think the third education revolution is to bring science and democracy into education, to make sure that Yale education, an Oxford education, everyone can access that sort of education. And I think that what we need to do in order to bring about the third education revolution is to change education from an art, an intuitive art, into a science. Right, so I think that education today is like medicine in the 19th century. It was very intuitive. It was very art, and then you had a generation of scientists who came into the medical profession and said, "Listen, we need data, we need evidence, we need rigorous examination of what we know and what we don't know," and that's brought about a revolution in medicine. And I believe that by bringing science into education, we can bring about the third education revolution. And I believe that artificial intelligence can play a vital role in helping us bring science into education.
You'll understand my skepticism, Jiang, when I say to you that your pitch that AI can transform education because of the collation of data and then the processing of data will draw rancor around the world, actually. And so how do you react to that? Because there is obviously what you make a lot of assumptions in what you've said there, or at least inferred summation is around the role of the teacher, the autonomy that a teacher has, and those kind of aspects. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so I would say, and that's a great question, and thanks for asking it, because you're challenging me to think deeper. But I would say that a lot of the issue in education today is that we have a lot of assumptions and we have a lot of beliefs, and we don't actually question these assumptions and beliefs. And a lot of them are just slogans that are passed around, like well-being, creativity. What does this actually mean from scientific from scientific perspective? And so I think it's really important that we as educators need to think very deeply about what we believe and ask ourselves, is the science and evidence and data back up what we believe? To be honest with you, you and I have been to a lot of education conferences. You and I will both note that these conferences are basically the same. It's really the same people saying the same things over and over. And I think a lot of it is because these assumptions are not being challenged. And so I think artificial intelligence, what it can do is provide real-time data and evidence for us to question these assumptions. So let me give you an example of this, okay? So what do we mean by evidence in education? We mean...
Let me stop you. Sorry, I want to ask you again. But does it not lead to the deprofessionalization of teaching?
Okay, that's a good question. If we as educators do not participate in the process, it can in fact lead to the replacement of teachers. right? I mean, if you just talk to a technologist who has a very one-sided perspective about what education means and does, basically he's like, okay, well, let's just improve test scores and parents will be happy and they'll pay for this product, right? So all we have to do is improve test scores. So how do we improve test scores? We make kids do test scores every single day, and that will improve test scores over a short amount of time. And we know that to be true. In long term, this will create corrosive effects and will stunt a child's emotional development, and we know that, right? So my greatest fear is that if we educators do not participate in this process of discussing the power of AI in education, the technologists will come in and just replace teachers with robots, and we'll be stuck with this system of memorization and regurgitation. But if you actually look at the evidence, and I keep on saying about the evidence, teachers are irreplaceable components of education, okay? Teachers, again, create this community of scholars that support each other and motivate students to thrive. And technology cannot replace that. So if we had a very serious discussion and examination of the proper role of teachers, then we would come to this conclusion. But unfortunately, right now, the education community is not having a serious discussion about AI.
And so, again, I just push on a little bit more. So in the West in particular, I remember there was a BBC report that I read last year about the use of facial recognition in classrooms in China. And, all the issues to do with privacy and so on and so forth obviously came to the fore, right? And we were aghast in many parts of the world as to this is what is happening in education in China. I mean, what is your comment on that?
Yeah, so I think there are two things going on, right? There's technology worship, and then there's some process, right? Technology worship is just like, we want facial recognition in the classroom because it looks cool, because parents are like, yes, let's do this because we want greater monitoring of our students, right? So the example you referred to is a school in Hangzhou that was using facial recognition technology to track the focus and the concentration levels of students. And if students were falling asleep, then the teachers would come and say, listen, you're falling asleep. And it was really to try to control the behavior of students, which I think is bad. Now that's a technology worship. The study process is really like, let's think about what we're trying to achieve. Let's collect evidence and ask ourselves, are we trying to achieve this, right? So basically, if you use scientific process, how it would work is, one, you say to yourself, listen, we're trying to increase motivation levels in the classroom, engagement levels, because this will lead to higher test scores, right? That's a hypothesis, okay? And then you're like, okay, well, how do you increase motivation levels? Do you have more cameras in the classroom? Do you record what happens in the classroom? Or do you have the teacher be more engaging? Do you have the teacher prepare more interesting material, right? So if you actually use a scientific process and combine with technology, you get different conclusions. But because in China, unfortunately, we have a worship of EdTech without using scientific process to evaluate the effectiveness of EdTech, we come to these silly scenarios where facial recognition technology is used in the classroom to monitor students rather than to track engagement levels in the classroom.
And so, Jiang, I want to move on to a set of questions to do with COVID and the closure of schools. We know a lot about how entire school systems have come to a close and are grappling with the pandemic. Tell me what happened in China with regards to schooling and education.
Right. So, the Chinese school system closed a lot earlier than the other school systems, and the impact wasn't as bad for students, right? So I know that in the West, there have been several mental health issues for students who've been stuck at home. Teenagers have killed themselves. It's been pretty bad. We have had mental health issues here in China, but it's been contained. And a lot of it is that parents are engaged in the education process, right? So when kids were at home, they weren't doing homework by themselves. the mother, the father were there as well, helping the kids do the homework. It was this family that really supported, scaffolded the kids during this crisis. But I mean, again, if you just left kids alone in front of a computer, then you would have a lot of issues. But of course, fortunately, because of the family engagement in China, we didn't have a lot of these mental health issues.
And so, how long were schools closed?
They were closed for a good 2 to 3 months.
But now they're back.
We're back in session, yes. We are now in Chinese New Year, and we've had several COVID outbreaks in different regions in China, so they've closed earlier. We might delay the opening of schools in the spring semester, but again, family engagement. And also, a lot of the kids learn material outside the classroom. They go to cram schools. So I think people here aren't as worried about school closures as they would be in the West.
And Jiang, in terms of we worry a lot about learning loss and catch up remedial learning. And so how will they be approaching that in China?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, what I've discovered in my research about EdTech is that it's really emotional support that scaffolds the learning, right? And this is true in China as well. So I'll give you an example of this, where last year, because of COVID-19, because of school closures, the government announced that the college entrance examination, what we refer to as a Gaokao, would be delayed by 1 month. And this has never happened before in the past 30 years. I mean, China has been through many crises. There was a major earthquake in China in 2008, and they still have the Gaokao. So the Gaokao, it's a major event. It's a major cultural and social and economic event, and they delayed it by 1 month. And the reason why was that students were reporting that they were less motivated to study at home than in the classroom. They were less focused, they were less motivated. So that sort of classroom setting where you're surrounded by peers and you have a similar goal, and you have a teacher motivating you on, encouraging you emotionally, I mean, it is vital to the learning process.
Thank you for that, Jiang. And my last question, I suppose, I want to ask you, and thank you so much for the time that you spent with us today, is what do you think the 3 lessons the world can learn from education in China are?
Education in China or education technology in China?
Education in China. And you may include education technology, but just generally, what is it that you think we can learn from you?
Okay, so lesson 1 is invest in your teachers, right? And that doesn't mean give them more money. We don't have that many examples where just paying teachers more will make them more motivated. It means providing them with support, right? So mentorship, professional development, and community, right? So make sure teachers feel that they're contributing to community in a positive way. So teacher investment, I think, is key. That's lesson 1. Lesson 2 is be really clear about what you're trying to achieve in education. I think that what separates China from other contexts is Chinese parents, Chinese teachers are very clear about what they're trying to achieve in education. Now, it's more test scores, it's higher test scores, and I think that's a bad thing. But I think having alignment, having engagement, having parents involved in the process is, I think, key to a better learning outcomes. And the third, and I think most important lesson is to focus on equity issues. From 1949 to 1999, China did that very well. It does it less well now, but it's still a major focus. And so what we find in education is that, these rich kids, smart kids, they do well by themselves. They're intrinsically motivated. They have massive family support. As a society, you have better outcomes when you invest in the most marginalized communities and the most marginalized children. It's just a better investment. And also, what happens if you do create equity is that your school system becomes more vibrant and more creative. How do you make good teachers into great teachers? What you do is you send them into the most marginalized communities and force them to rethink pedagogy, right? I mean, like if you're a really good teacher, you're teaching really good students, it's really easy to become complacent about your teaching, because whatever you say that the good students will automatically understand, or the good students will be self-motivated to learn material on their own. But if you're a good teacher and you go into a more impoverished community where students are less motivated and they have less learning strategies, then that forces you as a teacher to think more deeply about what works and what doesn't work in a classroom. So I would say these are the 3 big lessons, right? Invest in teachers. Make sure your teachers are happy and highly motivated. Second big lesson is make sure the entire community is engaged. Parents, teachers are aligned on goals. And third is focus on the most marginalized communities in your system.
And so there's a question that's come up from Gail Brown, which I've flashed onto the screen over here. It says, professional learning and professional learning communities are already commonplace. Do you think this learning beyond the classroom will support students in China to make better inferences and problem solve?
Okay, so professional learning is commonplace, but I think it's done differently in China. And the reason why is the entire community is invested in professional learning. So principals, parents, they're all involved in the process, which provides a greater feedback loop. I think that learning outside the classroom is key. I think that the world should be the classroom. I don't understand why schools are siloed off. And I think this is a major issue we face in China, where schools are too focused on tests and they're too isolated from the greater community and from global issues.
Great. There's also a comment from a gentleman called Kavin from, I assume, India. He said, I'm sure it's really tempting to use cool tech, such as facial recognition for the sake of it, but indeed being clear on the educational outcome first is important, because there might be a low-tech way to solve it, right? For example, a breakout session. I think you also support that.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, like, it's, he said it so well. But I mean, I was talking about how you want to focus on technology, or do you want to focus on the scientific process, right? Because technology, yeah, it's really cool to use facial recognition technology. But you actually use scientific process to think about education. What you realize is you actually don't need technology to solve most problems. If all you care about is student engagement, you don't have to spend any money to solve this problem.
Jiang, I owe you a huge thanks for today's interview. I know I have learned a lot, as always, in our conversations, and I look forward to having you back at a future opportunity to discuss these various subjects and the developments of education in China. But for now, please take from the T4 TV live community that we have learned a lot, and we look forward to your continued engagement. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Vikas.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.